I'm Hugh Hewitt. Welcome to the program. Hope many of you had a chance to see Vice President Vance on the Salem News Channel earlier or listen to him on the Salem Radio Network or our affiliates. I will talk about that later in the program. But I begin today with Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who has a brand new book out, Listening to the Law, which is a fabulous read, and I want to talk to her about that. I had a chance to do so 5 days ago at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, so this is round two, so I get to actually finish my question. Justice Barrett, thank you for a second bite at the apple. I have to begin, though, by asking, 2 hours after I was done talking to you, my colleague Charlie was murdered. Your reaction to that and to just generally political discourse in the United States, about which you write a lot in Listening to the Law.
That was horrific. I was at Notre Dame shortly after I left you at the Nixon Library, and the mood on campus was very somber. I mean, for the father of 2 young children and a husband to be murdered in cold blood was a tragedy and certainly sobering for the nation. And I think it is a sign of a culture that has where political discourse is soured beyond control and something that we need to really pull back. I mean, obviously, I assume that the person who murdered Charlie Kirk was mentally ill. But nonetheless, to create a culture in which political discourse can lead to political violence is unacceptable in the United States.
Justice, you quote your father in the book as saying repeatedly to you and your siblings, control your emotions or they will control you. It's very similar to a message I got repeatedly growing up. Do you think that message is out of style, or do parents have to double down on that message?
I think it's time to double down on that message. That was a message that, as you say, my father repeatedly gave my siblings and I. It's one that I've repeatedly given my own children, that I've put up in various places on index cards around our house to remind them of the message. And I think in political discourse and relating to one another just generally, I think we often let our emotions get out of control and we're driven by emotion rather than reason. It can take discipline to speak civilly and collegially to people with whom, one disagrees.
You reference G.K. Chesterton as well and his brother on page 38 of Listening to the Law. The two argued incessantly but never quarreled. You continued, a good argument involves logic and a search for truth. A quarrel is an effort to tear down your sparring partner. Sparring with intellectual opponents is the way to hear the other side. Shunning others just because they disagree with you is also a recipe for a lonely and ultimately unhappy life. Do you think that people are going to hear that message more clearly now?
I hope so. I mean, I really hope that the assassination of Charlie Kirk is a turning point for us as a society, where we look and see where things have come, the point at which we've come to in the United States. I mean, there's a big difference. I see 2 dangers that Chesterton passage that you just read gets at. One is to silo ourselves so that we don't engage with the other side. That's the opposite of what Charlie Kirk did. He consistently engaged the other side. I think the other message in that passage is that when you do engage the other side, we're engaging ideas and we're not trying to attack or tear down people. And there's a huge difference between the two. And I think those who fall into attacking people primarily do it verbally and not physically. But too often, I guess, we're now seeing that verbal attacks can spill over into something more sinister.
Justice, now I want to turn to Listening to the Law, and I'm going to come back to the problem of our culture in a moment. But I want to remind our audience that before you joined the Seventh Circuit in 2017, you had spent 15 years teaching at Notre Dame University's law school. Before that, you had clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Scalia, on the D.C. Circuit for Judge Silberman. You had attended Rhodes College. You'd worked at Miller Cassidy. You spent your whole early life in New Orleans, and now you've been on the Supreme Court for 5 years. Ought presidents to think, you represent something very different on the Supreme Court. A Southerner, though Louisiana and New Orleans are very different from the rest of the South, and not an Ivy League trained lawyer. I'm very happy to have the President of the United States, and I mentioned to you this on Wednesday, reaching beyond the Ivy Leagues for justices. Do you hope that continues at least intermittently in the years ahead?
I do. People have asked me that, especially as I've been around talking about the book. And it's not that I think people should be chosen from outside an Ivy League school for the sake of doing it, but I think people choose law schools for all kinds of different reasons. To assume that people are unqualified if they choose to apply to schools outside of the Ivy League and choose to attend those schools, I think really distorts and takes people out of the running who make decisions based not solely on prestige, who make decisions based on scholarships and financial aid, who make decisions based on geographic considerations like the locations of their family. Just don't think we have a culture in which every single person is motivated to apply to and then only attend the top ranked law school which they get into. That was not how my own decision process unfolded.
Now, Justice Barrett, the very last justice of the Supreme Court that you mention or quote in listening to the law is the great Potter Stewart, the great pragmatist. Uh, and is it incidental, accidental, or intentional that you quoted him at the end? The judge, the justice best known for "I know it when I see it," but he also said the docket of the Supreme Court is a fairly reliable mirror of our domestic problems confronting our nation. I agree with that, but were you doing something intentional in pointing at Justice Potter Stewart, who was a long time sort of center right justice?
No, and Hugh, I confess that when I quoted that passage, it didn't occur to me that I might be sending a subtle message. I quoted it because of the quote itself. I think a lot of people think that the court somehow sets its own agenda or goes out and finds, the most controversial cases to decide. But I think Justice Stewart was absolutely right. If you look at the court, you see back a reflection of what's happening in the country.
Listening to the law is almost Bartlett's when it comes to quotations about the Constitution and the Supreme Court. But however, one that does not include either is John Adams on Ben Franklin. And John Adams was very disapproving of Ben Franklin's style of life. Adams said, "As far as fate shall compel me to sit with him in public affairs, I shall treat him with decency and perfect impartiality." Then you add, "There's no reason to treat colleagues any other way." I see that breaking down. I try and abide by that myself, but do you see it breaking down?
I do see that breaking down, and I think it goes back to what you talked about in the beginning, which is learning how to debate ideas and attack ideas, not people. I guess I think the idea or the notion that you can't like and work with or treat civilly, as John Adams with Ben Franklin, people with whom you disagree or even that you dislike is just foreign to the way we ought to be conducting public affairs and personal ones. I mean, it kind of is back to that control your emotions or they'll control you. I mean, frankly, in every walk of life, you're not going to like everybody, but you can't, you've got to control your emotions and you just can't treat people consistent with the way you sometimes might feel about them.
Well said. Let me go now to some nitty gritty of the law. I brought this up at the Nixon Library, concurring opinions. We covered this a bit. On page 39, you explain that you sometimes write concurrences, quote, to identify areas of law that could benefit from development by advocates and scholars. And you footnoted that to Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. One of our regular listeners is now retired Archbishop of Philadelphia, Chaput, who brought that case. And in that concurrence, you invited scholars to opine on what could replace the test of employment division versus Smith, which is a little too geeky for the audience. But then you surprised me at the library by saying no one had taken up the challenge. Does that happen often? Do scholars avoid the stuff that the justices could profit from?
I'm waiting, Hugh, after I said that at the Nixon Library, I'm waiting for a deluge of law review reprints from scholars who say, I certainly have taken you up on that challenge. I do over every summer try to read scholarship to see what has come up in the interim. I haven't had time this particular summer to do that with respect to Fulton, so maybe I missed something. I think people respond with scholarship to their interests. It could be that people have not been interested in that case. And I haven't had another case present that question squarely, so I haven't had reason to dive in. But I mean, I think if the court or an individual justice on the court highlights a particular area as one that would be useful to get more scholarship on, I would think that would be a motivation. It would have been to me as a law professor.
Yeah, let's pause right there. I spoke with Justice Barrett at just about an hour before the program began, but didn't interrupt the conversation for the benefit of flow. I will come back with more of Justice Barrett as well as some of Vice President Vance's comments about my colleague Charlie Kirk. I'm going to return to my interview with Justice Barrett in 1 minute. First, I want to play for you the opening of Vice President Vance sitting in for my deceased colleague Charlie Kirk today, cut number 11.
Hey, everybody. J.D. Vance here, live from my office in the White House complex and filling in for somebody who cannot be filled in for, but I'm going to try to do my best, my dear friend, the great Charlie Kirk. The last several days have been extremely hard for our country. They've been hard for me, hard for my family, hard for the countless people in this building who knew and loved Charlie Kirk, and of course, they've been hardest most of all for his darling wife, Erica, and their two beautiful children.
That is a wonderful interview that he gave and a wonderful hosting job that he did, impromptu. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, from everyone at the Salem Media Corporation. I'll come back to that after I conclude. I've got a lot of conversation with Justice Barrett to play for you, so let's go back to that interview. I would have thought Judge McConnell would have weighed in, but then again, he took over the job of Chief Justice of the Meta Supreme Court, so maybe he hadn't had the time, but I am surprised, and I hope just by bringing it up here, the 9,000 full-time law professors in the United States give an ear to that because it's a difficult issue. It's a very an important one. I do want to repeat about Abigail Adams because I found it fascinating in the book that her portrait, and you confirmed it on Wednesday, hangs in your office. Would you tell the audience why they should read, get the full story and listening to the law, but why?
Sure. In brief, the Constitution is obviously a large part of what I do. And because I interpret the Constitution as an originalist, I look back to the founding era a lot. And I wanted some inspiration, some reminder of that in my office. But I also wanted it to come from someone whose life looked at least a little bit like mine, despite the fact of living in a very different age. And there were no women at the Constitutional Convention or any of the state ratifying conventions. So Abigail Adams is about the closest that we can come. She was very involved in advising her husband, John, about public affairs. She was very attentive to all the affairs of the time. Yet she raised a large family, managed her family's finances, all while participating to the greatest degree that she could at the time in the formation of the country. So I have her up above the mantle in my office. It would make you dizzy if I picked up the iPad I'm using right now to flip it around so you could see that picture, but I reprinted in the book just to remind me of Abigail and her participation in the founding of the Republic, and just to inspire me about the promise of America, because now, of course, I can do what she could not, serve simultaneously on the Supreme Court and as a mother.
Oh, I'm glad you added that, as a mother. Anyone who has not watched the HBO series Adams from, 15 years ago, I would recommend because of its portrayal not only of John Adams, but of Abigail Adams. It's fabulous. Justice Barrett, we also talked about the founding era. Now, the Second Continental Congress passed the Declaration of Independence, and there are parts of it, and you told me why it does not count for you in interpreting originalist intent. But I went back after we talked and I read it. And for example, in the Bill of Particulars, the Second Continental Congress wrote, King George has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people, eat out their substance. That seemed to me to be one of the examples where the Declaration might, figure into Loper Bright or the Major Questions Doctrine or something like that. Would you explain to people again, as you did at the library so eloquently, why you do not consider the Declaration as among the founder materials relevant to the interpretation of the Constitution?
Well, maybe I didn't explain clearly what I meant by that. I don't consider the Declaration, I understand some people to make the argument that the Declaration itself is a source of law. And I don't consider it to be a source of law because the Declaration of Independence wasn't ratified as law as our Constitution was. But I do think when you look at the founding era and you look at the array of materials, certainly I would look at the Declaration of Independence, much like I would read Blackstone's commentaries. It was part of the political culture in which those who adopted our Constitution were steeped.
Oh, I misunderstood you then. because that is exactly what I thought that's what you were going to say, and I didn't hear it, but that's on me.
Ah,
I want to go to the very interesting part of listening to the law, where you add your voice to that of many scholars that the Sedition Act of John Adams' era was unconstitutional. Good on you. What do you think about Thomas Jefferson's acquisition of the Louisiana Territory?
that's an interesting point. Thomas Jefferson himself thought his acquisition of Louisiana Territory was beyond his power. He thought it might be unconstitutional, but he did it anyway, which is an interesting addendum. I mean, I think at this point in the day, and as someone who was born in Louisiana, I'm certainly not advocating for an argument that the Louisiana Territory is not validly part of the United States. I think that's been settled by time, even if Thomas Jefferson was right to doubt his own constitutional authority.
Are there other parts of the old law that need to be clarified, such as your comment? The court officially repudiated Korematsu, thank goodness, and for the benefit of the lay people out there, the decision of the court that the internment of Japanese American citizens was constitutional at the time has been repudiated by the Supreme Court subsequently. Is there any other cleanup on aisle 3, the Kmart green light thing? Does the Supreme Court need to do that?
You mean overrule a precedent or clarify that some past act actually was unconstitutional?
Correct.
So I mean, there are certainly cases in my own personal capacity or that I might have thought as a law professor were wrongly decided and then I wish the court would correct. But just now, in my capacity as a justice, I can't identify those cases with the same freedom that I could before, because I have to stay my hand in the event that any of those questions actually came before the court. Because
Yeah, of course
they
you
would,
do. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the court, with respect to the sedition acts, the court itself has said that those were unconstitutional, in New York Times versus Sullivan. The court acknowledged that, and I think that's pretty widely regarded as unconstitutional. So it's not a controversial question likely to come up before us. So I try to be pretty careful in the book to hew towards describing opinions that the court itself has already expressed.
You also note in the book that the Roberts Court, of which you are a part, that's a direct quote, averages about one overruling a precedent a term, which is below the historical average for any of the other courts. And with that in mind, what is your advice to lawyers and litigants about tilting at windmills? When I teach con law, I advise my law students, do not waste your clients' time and money unless they're really interested in tilting at a windmill and trying to go after, for example, New York Times v. Sullivan, because it's not likely to happen. What's your advice to lawyers and litigants on that, Justice?
I think that's true. And lawyers and litigants, of course, their chances of getting up to the Supreme Court are pretty slim. They're starting in district courts, and district courts have to abide because of, vertical stare decisis. They have to follow and apply the decisions of the Supreme Court, and so do the courts of appeals. And the lower courts are not going to, and they don't have the authority to contradict existing Supreme Court precedents. And then there are 4,000 cert petitions filed a year. The court takes 55 or 60 of those. So you're really tilting at windmills to spend all the money litigating it all the way up and then trying to run through the narrow gate to get on the court's docket. Then unless you're pretty
Pause right there. We'll be right back. Advice for all lawyers and litigants right there. Justice Barrett will be back. Earlier today, Vice President Vance hosted the Charlie Kirk Show. One of the things he said that I think bears repeating, cut number 13.
I don't think that I'm alone in saying that Charlie was the smartest political operative I ever met. Everyone knew him as this fearless debater, this guy who would take the conservative message into hostile places and inspire younger generations to have courage. One thing that's hit a lot of those young Americans... I have to agree with the Vice President on that.
Absolutely fearless. I want to go back now to my conversation with Justice Barrett, who has a new book out, Listening to Law. Justice Amy Coney Barrett's new book is called Listening to Law. It's available everywhere. I had just asked her, when is it wise for the litigants and the lawyers to jump on a case that, if you look at existing Supreme Court precedent, isn't really a good bet? There are exceptions to that rule. Cut Continue.
and then trying to run through the narrow gate to get on the court's docket, then unless you're pretty certain that you have a case that's on such shaky ground and that the court has signaled would satisfy the high standard for overruling, I mean, I don't think it's probably a good expenditure of clients' money to tilt at those windmills.
Now, Justice, it's been a very busy summer for the court when it normally isn't. Your colleague, Justice Gorsuch, who's been a guest on this program, issued a rather sharp concurrence in an emergency docket case this summer at district courts who are not abiding by settled case law. Was this unusual in your experience of the past 5 years, and ought it to stop, and do you think it will?
The emergency docket has been going on. These emergency motions where litigants come to the Supreme Court and seek relief on an interim basis, before litigation has been completed in the courts below. It's not new to the past 6 months, but it has definitely accelerated in the last 6 months. I think it's a bad way to run a railroad. I'm not sure if it's unavoidable, and we have to rule on the motions that are filed. We can't ignore them. So I don't see a way for the court itself to extricate itself from this process. How one could stop it and channel this litigation differently, I think is something that's largely beyond the court's control. So there's just been a lot of litigation. There've been a lot of executive orders, but there's been a lot of litigation, a lot of many, many injunctions entered by lower courts. And so that's just contributed to a state of affairs where we've been very busy over the summer.
Now, just for a moment, I want to talk about WebRoot to you, one of our sponsors. We are not, as NPR was, subsidized by the government. Webroot.com/Hewitt is one of our sponsors. It provides you protection in a dangerous age online, and you really need protection in a dangerous age online. I have a YouTube video with Victor Hansen that 600,000 people have watched over at YouTube, in which Victor disclosed he was a victim of identity theft and financial fraud. I don't know what he's done. I'm sure he has taken steps now, but don't let that happen to you. Go to webroot.com/Hewitt. Ask for WebRoot Total Protection. 50% off right now. WebRoot Total Protection gives you insurance for your life. You get antivirus, secure VPN, cloud backup. You'll get a dedicated elder fraud hotline. Also monitors your identity and looks at the dark web for signs of trouble. And it's 50% off right now. You also get up to $1 million reimbursement in the cost of identity theft. So go and check out webroot.com/Hewitt. And it's also relieffactor.com time. Now, it's been a crazy weekend and a difficult weekend. And stress builds up when friends and colleagues are in trouble. And I've never really gone through a friend being murdered or a colleague being assassinated from Salem. But I also didn't get any exercise in. So that means tomorrow's going to be pay the piper time, because I got to get back out there, because the only way to get rid of stress is exercise. Healthy way to get rid of stress is exercise. So I take my Relief Factor every single day in the first hour, even on days when I talk to Supreme Court justices, which are themselves big days and stressful days, and days when the vice president sits in for the deceased colleague. So I want you to know it works. I want you to know if you've got minor aches and pains and it's not something that is warrants going to a doctor, warrants going to a physical therapist. You know what you did. Picked up the boxes the wrong way. You went too far. You worked out too hard. You lifted the toddler the wrong way. You ought to give Relief Factor not just a try, but you ought to make it a part of your life. Now, the starter pack is only $19.95, which is $1 a day for 3 weeks. $19.95 3-week supply. You take 3 packs a day for the first week, 2 packs a day for the second week, a single pack a day for the week thereafter. And it'll go to work on whatever ails you. If it's a minor ache and pain, don't live with it. Get rid of it. 1-800, the number 4, and the word relief, or go find the starter pack at their website at relieffactor.com, relieffactor.com. Justice Amy Coney Barrett of the United States Supreme Court has a brand new book out, Listening to the Law. She joined me last hour. Here is part 3 of that interview. You went out of your way to make this Listening to the Law accessible, and my highly annotated book here, accessible to non-lawyers. And I appreciate that, because if people don't often understand the work of the court. So I want to cover a couple of things that you said that might be just beyond the grasp of a layman. Page 141 to 2. By adopting the Bill of Rights, the founding generation made the Constitution a more morally laden document. Americans wanted specifics, and they wanted them in writing, promises that the federal government would not violate the rights that Americans considered most sacred. Morally laden document. I think I know what that means, but what do you mean by that?
Well, I think the Bill of Rights, for those in the audience who are not lawyers, the original Constitution dealt only with the structure of the government, set up Congress and the presidency and the judiciary, but it didn't protect our rights. The Bill of Rights, the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech, for example, was not part of the original document. And the Bill of Rights, certainly those amendments and then many of the amendments that we've added since actually expressed the values and the principles that we as Americans hold dear. And that's what I meant by morally laden document, one that actually expressed value judgments and didn't deal simply with the structures of government itself.
Now, when I teach fundamental rights, I'm going to be using your commentary on Washington v. Glucksberg, which is a 1997 case, special protection for some fundamental rights that, while not mentioned in the United States Constitution, are nevertheless, and I'm quoting the case here, not you, though you quote it, deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition and implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. Is that an open-ended invitation to sift through and root about the ratification debates, for example, or among the 7 of the 8 amendments that were originally proposed by Madison that didn't make it into the Bill of Rights or the 1992 ratification of the long dormant amendment? Would the framers, what do you think? Do those matter?
Well, let's see. Washington versus Glucksberg was an attempt to narrow and channel the court's activity and to try to take the court out of the business of rummaging around in the area of individual rights and to channel that authority so that the court was not, for lack of a better word, inventing rights or simply plucking out and imposing rights that the justices thought should be valuable, imposing them on the people by incorporating them into the Constitution.
And do you think that will be a limiting principle on, Judge Bork used to say the Ninth Amendment's an inkblot, and I'm not really in a hurry to open up the Constitution for non-originalists who want to import today's moral milieu, whatever it might be, whatever they think it is, into the Constitution. Is the Glucksberg precedent the one you want people to understand? It's got to be deeply rooted in history and tradition, really anchored.
Absolutely, because the Glucksberg precedent is the court's latest, and it is the controlling statement of what the court's approach is, the methodological approach to interpreting the 14th Amendment's due process clause, which under current doctrine is the source of unenumerated rights. And by unenumerated rights, I mean those that are not spelled out in the Constitution, in contrast to freedom of speech. Those rights like the freedom to marry, which is not expressly mentioned in the Constitution, but under the Glucksberg test, one might say, well, that's deeply rooted in our history and tradition at the most specific level. So yeah, that is what the court has said is the test.
Now, Justice Barrett, the two parts of the Constitution that I think have strayed the furthest from the original intent, the Free Exercise Clause, which we've already talked about, but also the Takings Clause. And do you think the framers, or even the Anti-Federalists especially, would recognize modern jurisprudence since Village of Euclid? I don't think they would.
There are a lot of things about our jurisprudence under the Takings Clause and probably and certainly outside the Takings Clause too that the founders would not recognize.
Do you call that out as a part of your instructions to clerks? Let's make sure we call out this area and how it connects back to the framers when you're giving them instructions on research and direction for the bench memos?
I do not, because one principle that controls in judging is that precedent applies unless, you and I were talking a few moments ago about stare decisis and whether it's tilting at windmills for litigants to ask for precedent to be overruled. We certainly have some cases in which we overrule precedent, as you pointed out, on average, one a year. But if we are not expressly considering whether to overrule a precedent, the court's practice is to take all of our prior cases as settled and go from there. So I don't tell clerks to go back and set all the precedent aside and dig down to the original meeting, starting, in other words, from scratch.
Okay. Now, this is a subjective question completely. I used to be dazzled at the D.C. Circuit by the quality of the oral argument. I was just amazed at the lawyers. And I've only been in the Supreme Court audience on one occasion. Is there a difference in the quality of the Supreme Court bar from the bar in the Seventh Circuit or the D.C. Circuit when you were a clerk, or are they all pretty much 5 stars?
If you ever want to come to another argument, Hugh, consider it an open invitation. As for the quality of lawyering, I would say there were certainly some fantastic advocates that I saw at the Seventh Circuit. But on the whole, I have very rarely seen in my 5 years on the court someone who was anything less than an excellent oral argument. The Supreme Court bar tends to be fairly specialized, and so it's populated with very talented appellate lawyers. And there are so few cases at the court, so few cases get oral arguments, that there's a lot of competition among those lawyers to get the cases, as opposed to the Seventh Circuit, where we hear many oral arguments. And so, there are just more lawyers participating in the process and it's less specialized.
Well, pause right there, because I'm going to ask her the difficult question that I have been asked repeatedly over the course of I've never argued before the Supreme Court, argued before the Ninth Circuit, clerked on the D.C. Circuit, but I haven't argued before the Supreme Court. I'm going to ask her, if you get to the Supreme Court, do you stick with the lawyer who got you there, or you go out and find the specialist? I'm just about to ask a question to Supreme Court Justice Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett, not about her new book, Listening to the Law, but one, a stray foul ball for me, which is, do you go to the court with the lawyer that won for you or lost for you at the appellate level, or do you go get a specialist? Here's that conversation. Would you be willing to opine on this, Justice Barrett? Usually when the court grants cert, my advice to anyone who's ever asked, and it's happened a few times over the years, do I go with the lawyer who got me there, or do I go find a specialist? I invariably say, go hire Paul Clement if you can, and if you can't, go hire someone he recommends. Do not take your lawyer from the appellate division, no matter how good they are, or how long they've stuck with you, or how loyal they have been to you, and how they've let you ride along for free, because it's a different skill set. Do you agree with me, or do you think you ought to give everyone a shot to go up there?
Well, let's see. I think it's generally pretty high risk. I agree with you to stick with the lawyer that was with you below, because it is different to practice in front of the Court of Appeals and certainly in front of a trial court than in the Supreme Court. I'm hesitant to say that you should only consider existing Supreme Court litigators, because then that would make them a closed set and it would make it hard for anyone else to break in. But I certainly don't think you should just default to sticking with the lawyer you have. And I think it would be a good idea to ask Paul Clement or any other experienced litigator from the court if there's someone that they recommend. I wouldn't be afraid to give someone a chance. There are often, because arguments are such a scarcity, there are often many young, ambitious appellate lawyers willing to take a case pro bono at the Supreme Court simply to get an opportunity to make the argument.
Now, I was surprised. Right there. There's more coming up. But I want that to settle a bit. There are some young, ambitious lawyers who are Supreme Court bar adjacent, right? So they're working along with former Solicitor General Clement or Chuck Cooper or any number of lawyers out there who are willing to do it for free because they want to break the ice and get that first argument. But what I want to underscore for people is don't just go with the fellow or the lady who brought you. I do want to play a couple more cuts of Vice President Vance. Cut number 14.
One thing that's hit a lot of those young Americans over the last week was how Charlie was there for them when others were not. When they were afraid to speak their minds, when they were afraid of what a professor would say, when they were afraid that they would be shouted down by their peers, Charlie was there, showing them that they could be courageous and that they could be bold.
And cut number 15.
Charlie was a visionary. He was a luminary. He brought together people. He didn't just teach people how to speak. He didn't just teach people what to say. He didn't just teach people they could actually speak their mind on campus. He created a whole social network for an entire generation of young.
He did indeed. I'll play more of the Vice President's guest hosting on the Charlie Kirk Show today, as well as the balance of my interview with Justice Amy Coney Barrett over the next 2 hours. Coming up this hour, Senator Tom Cotton will be along after the break, and parts 4 and 5 of my interview with Justice Amy Coney Barrett from 2 hours ago. In fact, I want to get to that right now. Here's my conversation with Justice Barrett in mid-interview. Of the law, that oral argument can indeed and has changed your mind. You want to expand on that for people? Because I've always thought it's kind of fun for me and for other people who follow the law to listen to them, but I wasn't really sure that it was other than a debating technique for the conference that was going to follow.
You know, sometimes it does change my mind. I mean, most often I would say when oral argument does have an effect on me and kind of moves me from the place that I was when I went into the oral argument, having read the briefs and all of the legal authorities, I think it's most often in the scope of the decision or how the decision is going to be decided. But sometimes it actually moves me on the bottom line. And I think, you know, it's a mistake to think of oral argument as just a throwaway.
Now, I want to have you argue a little bit with Justice Breyer by remote. He was on this program when he came out with his book, and we got around to talking about the internet, and his argument was George Washington didn't know about the internet, and my response was George Washington knew about liberty. What do you make of that exchange? Because it's my favorite exchange maybe in 25 years of radio.
Of course, George Washington didn't know about the internet, and neither did any of the founders. But if we're thinking about, for example, freedom of speech, that principle applies beyond, you know, the pamphleteer. The internet is a way of communicating ideas, and so freedom of speech and the language, and as you say, this idea of liberty, the freedom that we have to speak and communicate our ideas and argue, applies to the internet just as easily as it does to, you know, the town crier passing out pamphlets in the town square. I think it's a caricature of originalism to say that we must interpret the Constitution only through the eyes of problems that the founders could foresee.
So, Justice, we don't want to talk about the specifics of the murder of Charlie because it may end up before the court. But we do have a First Amendment regime where you really can't act against the speaker unless they have the intent to cause violence and the imminent ability to do so. It's a pretty tenured decision now. As the internet progresses and the deep web becomes darker and all of these crazy chat rooms develop that we have seen in the news, what do you advise, to the extent that it is appropriate to do so, Congress to think about when they think about regulating the web?
Well, as you say, Congress's ability to regulate speech is circumscribed by the First Amendment. And so the court has any number of cases. In fact, we had one last term involving the regulation of children's access to porn, which happens, of course, mostly online. You know, I'm not sure that regulation or legislation is going to be the most effective way to stamp out, just as a policy matter. I don't know that that's going to be the most effective way of stamping out some of the cesspool that we have on the dark web and on the internet generally, just because of Congress's restraint. I mean, because it's constrained by the First Amendment.
Let me ask you as a mother, not as a justice. What have you and your husband done about internet access for your children? Some of whom are adults now, but I mean, it's a real deal for my children now that they have children. And I sit in the back saying, don't let anything in the house. Don't let them have anything. But it's not really practical.
It's one of the most difficult things about parenting in the modern era, I would say. You know, we use screening software that we check. You know, we have parental controls on their phones. We try to have very tight control over the TV. We have time limits on their devices. And it's still very difficult to keep up with, all of the things that they do online. And my kids are very good, but you can very easily inadvertently wander. So it's important to be vigilant. We don't allow them to have social media until we've kind of set around 16 as the age. One of my sons recently got Instagram, but the condition was that he read The Anxious Generation with us. We watched a documentary together about the effects of social media on teenagers, and then we had to have a discussion about it. And he's only allowed to be friends on Instagram with people who he knows. And we check and he has to be friend. I don't have social media, but my husband has an Instagram account solely for the purpose of tracking what our children are doing online. And he has to allow my husband to be his friend.
John Haidt is one of my heroes, and I think Governor Youngkin, I'm a member, I'm a citizen of the Commonwealth, has done us a great favor by urging every school in the Commonwealth to ban phones from campus. I don't think I take you into the shoals of commentary that you may not issue. What do you think of that advice from the governor?
Well, the school that my children attend requires them to leave their cell phones in the lockers at the beginning of the day, and they can't get them back until the end of the day. So if a parent needs to reach a child during the school day, has to do it through the office. And I think that's excellent advice. I can't imagine how children can focus on learning if they have access to a cell phone. So I wouldn't allow my kids to take their phones into school for that reason, just as a parent. I'm speaking as a parent. I think it's been a very good practice for my children to have that rule.
Now, I want to make sure I get to a few things that I did not get to last week in our remaining 12 minutes, Justice Barrett, and thank you for the time again. Listening to the Law is a fabulous book. The best days are days when joint memos come in quickly without requests for changes. How often does that happen, and are you ever surprised by a justice, a particular justice doing it on a particular case that's been discussed in conference?
So join memos coming in without requests for changes. The more complicated a case, the more likely you are to get requests for changes from your colleagues. So I describe in the book one particular occasion in which joint memos came in quickly. And to be clear, I don't say which case that was, but where joint memos came in particularly quickly. So my law clerks and I popped a bottle of champagne to celebrate once we had everyone in on the case.
That's it. Not often, though. Questions for law students who are out there. If they are not intending to do a clerkship, should they even think about law review?
I think law review teaches some valuable skills. I find, and I found this in practice as a young associate and watching others with whom I worked, it teaches a real attention to detail and to editing. There's just, in fact, my husband did clerk, but he helped me. He read chapters of the book, and he was the editor in chief of the law review. And all of these years later, he still has such a sharp eye for editing and for grammar and for, spaces that shouldn't be in there, that I do think that there's value to it. I also think it opens the doors. It is for better or for worse, it is a gold star on your resume that will open doors to jobs at law firms and other places because it marks you as someone who's a good student and attentive to detail.
Now, you can't choose to become Order of the Coif. That's just something that you get. But moot court absorbs a lot of students' time in enormous amounts. What is the value of that after 15 years in the classroom and almost a decade on the bench now?
I think moot court, there aren't that many opportunities in law school to do things that actually mimic what you would do as a lawyer. In moot court, you're writing briefs and you're making arguments to a judge or to a panel of judges. And I think that's good practice. I think to allow any particular activity to suck up so much of your time that you don't have enough time to devote to your classes is a bad idea. But the opportunity to see what it's like to argue in front of judges and be articulate on your feet, I think can serve you well in your career.
So, Justice, now I want to talk about the 9,000 law professors and the faculties that they make up and the committees on curriculum on which they serve. There's been quite a lot of change in recent years, but no one is in a hurry to add American history, despite my many urgent suggestion that they do so on this program. What would you delete from the law school curriculums generally, and what would you insist on a 2L or a 3L taking that is not right now required?
So I taught, for listeners who are unaware of my background, I taught at Notre Dame. I can't remember if we talked about that earlier. And my experience then is limited to the curriculum at Notre Dame. And I wouldn't want to offend any of my former colleagues by saying I would cut their class. But I do think that there are certain classes that all students should take. And there's been a move among law schools to not require classes anymore, except for very few. Certainly the classes that are the traditional first year classes, civil procedure, torts, contracts, the basics need to be taken. But I think a lot of law schools have added courses in legislation and regulation. I think that's really valuable because most of what young lawyers are going to do is deal with statutes and deal with administrative regulations. I know you've had Justice Gorsuch on, and certainly he's written a lot about how many regulations that we
Let's
have.
pause right there. I'll come back and pick up her recommendations on curriculum after United States Senator Tom Cotton is from Arkansas. He is not only chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he's also chairman of the Republican Conference in the Senate. Senator, welcome. There's a lot going on in the Middle East today. Secretary Rubio is there. And I'm curious whether or not you are alarmed by reports that some of our Arab allies are considering breaching their deals with Israel.
Hugh, it's good to be on with you. I'm glad to see Secretary Rubio in Israel. I know he's been there for the past couple of days. There's been very moving images of Mr. Huckabee praying at the Western Wall, and obviously they're closely on the next steps to not end the war in Gaza, but to win the war in Gaza, to totally and completely destroy Hamas and to completely rip it out root and branch from that soil, from the broader Middle East. I don't want to get into too much speculation about what our Arab friends may or may not do. My recommendation, obviously, would be that the Abraham Accords have been a great source of security and prosperity for them and will be going forward, and we'd like to see them expanded in some way to other nations, too. And as they saw over the summer, Israel and the United States are by far the best friends and partners they can have, both for their own security and to help grow the economy. Let's not China.
Do you think, Senator,
Moment of need.
You're breaking up a little bit, so I'm sorry if I stepped on you there a little bit. Do you think if Egypt were to withdraw from the Camp David Accords, as President Sisi has intimated but not actually threatened, that it would impact the relationship of Egypt with the United States, or ought to?
Well, I think regrettably it would. Again, I have not seen such a threat or a desire to consider it, and we hope those are just ill-founded rumors. Obviously, it would lead to an immediate change of the situation in the Sinai and on the Israeli and Egyptian border, because the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, going back now almost 50 years, along with the slightly younger peace agreement with Jordan, is foundational to Israel's security and to our alliance and security structure in the Middle East. So I hope that all of our Arab friends will realize that they want to cast their lot with Israel and the United States, not with any other nations.
Do you believe that in the United States, last night were the Emmys, and we had the usual denunciation of Israel from inside Hollywood crowd. I don't think it moves public opinion at all. I think public opinion is solidly behind the Jewish state and will remain there in America. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, no question, Hugh. Certainly among Republicans and independents, which make up a pretty sizable majority now of public opinion, support for Israel is rock solid. Even among Democrats, some older Democrats and more moderate Democrats around the country, they still support Israel. What you do have is a very vocal, very animated, in some cases very violent, left-wing faction of pretty much openly anti-Zionist and even anti-Semitic Democrats on the far left.
So, Senator, I want to turn to the continuing resolution that Leader Thune is attempting to navigate. Senator Schumer has said it's got to have A, B, and C added to it. In the House, Congressman Cole has said, we may want to address some security issues in the aftermath of Charlie's murder, but we don't want anything else. What's the status of the of the CR as opposed to appropriations bills that might deal with Obamacare?
Yeah, Hugh, I can't give you an up-to-the-minute status, but as of this morning, I think we are waiting for the House of Representatives to release the text of the bill. I've spoken with both the Speaker and John Thune in the last couple of days, and they expect it to be a very straightforward continuing resolution that funds the government at past levels through, say, the week before Thanksgiving. And that'll give the Congress time to get the work done that Chuck Schumer has prevented us from doing by blockading all of our nominees, tying up the Senate, which is passing the annual spending bills. Again, this is something Chuck Schumer never did in 4 years when he ran the Senate because he wanted to hold all that power for himself. Republicans would like to have an orderly process where everyone gets a say, we get to address each other's priorities, the priorities of our states. Again, I think that's where we're going. It could include some small modifications, Hugh. Like I know the president's budget people sent forward a request for increased security for the president and for the judiciary. We would certainly be mindful of that, and I'd personally be supportive of moving forward with it. I don't know if they've developed any recommendations for enhanced security at the Capitol or for senators and congressmen, but I'd be willing to consider that as well. But other than those small matters, I don't think you see anything coming out of the House to the Senate other than just a straightforward, simple resolution that keeps the government funded and gives Congress time to finish our main work, which is passing the annual spending bills. And if Chuck Schumer wants to shut down the government over that, well, I guess we're going to have a Schumer shutdown then.
All right. Now I want to change over to my friend Charlie and colleague Charlie. Vice President Vance sat in for him today on the Salem Network on the Charlie Kirk Show, and I've been playing bits of that. People can find the entire program online. And then Justice Barrett was my guest earlier today, and I'm playing that interview across 3 hours so that people in every hour can hear the justice talk about her book, Listening to Law. But she remarked on the somber nature of the campus at Notre Dame, where she had done a talk this weekend after I talked to her on Wednesday, everything sort of having changed in the younger generation. Has it been the source of a lot of concern or just a different mood in the Senate since that happened?
Well, Hugh, obviously I want to express my deepest condolences to Eric Kirk, Charlie's widow, and to his 2 young children and his family and friends and all those who were touched by his remarkable work among America's youth. And I think we need to put it in broader context. There's the immediate context of his murderer, who I gather will face the death penalty, and he should. But also the trend of left-wing violence in this country. I'm sorry, Hugh, that this may offend some, but this is not a problem on both sides. Political violence in America is almost exclusively left-wing violence directed at people on the right. Charlie Kirk, Donald Trump, Brett Kavanaugh, members of Congress at a congressional baseball practice, all attacked by left-wing activists who wanted to kill them, and sadly, in Charlie's case, who succeeded. I know the media loves to throw out other examples, but those are a horse of a different color. Paul Pelosi was attacked by a homeless schizophrenic. Those 2 Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota were attacked by a Tim Walz supporter. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, had his mansion burned by a left-wing pro-Hamas activist for not being left-wing enough. And unfortunately, Hugh, you see it in public opinion polling as well. Almost no Republicans condone or celebrate violence, and a lot of Democrats, when asked in those polls, do. Or Hugh, I think you can just see it in the contrast of what's happened over the last 4 or 5 days in America. When Charlie Kirk was brutally murdered last week, his supporters held prayer vigils. When George Floyd died, his supporters burned down American cities in some of the worst riots ever. So political violence in America is almost exclusively left-wing violence, and the left in America needs to address it. And the administration, I'm pleased to say, is going to investigate the networks that are behind some of the funding and support that you've seen, for instance, in the riots in Portland in 2020. They should, and we should support them.
I heard Steve Miller vow that to the Vice President today. I was glad to hear it. Senator Cotton, thank you for your time today and for your comments about Charlie. Much appreciated by everyone across the Salem News Channel, the Salem Radio Network, Salem Media as a whole. Thank you, Senator Tom Cotton. Earlier today, Vice President Vance sat in as the host of the Charlie Kirk Show for our murdered colleague, Charlie Kirk. And this is the first half of how he closed that show today, cut number 17.
Shortly after Usha and I left Charlie's family and Charlie's remains in Arizona, I read a story in The Nation magazine about my dear friend, Charlie Kirk. Now, The Nation isn't a fringe blog. It's a well-funded, well-respected magazine whose publishing history goes back to the American Civil War. George Soros's Open Society Foundation funds this magazine, as does the Ford Foundation and many other wealthy titans of the American progressive movement. The writer accuses Charlie of saying, and I quote, "Black women do not have brain processing power to be taken seriously." But if you go and watch the clip, the very clip she links to, you realize he never said anything like that. He never uttered those words. He made an argument against affirmative action as a policy. He criticized a specific Supreme Court justice as an individual. He never said anything about black women as a group. He made an argument for judging people of all races and backgrounds by their own individual merits. The very evidence she provides, this hack of a writer, shows that she lied about a dead man, and yet she wrote it. An esteemed magazine published it. It made it through the editors, and of course, liberal billionaires rewarded that attack. Now, of course, even if Charlie had uttered those words, it wouldn't mean that he deserved his fate. But consider the level of propaganda at work. Charlie was gunned down in broad daylight, and well-funded institutions of the left lied about what he said so as to justify his murder. This is soulless and evil. But I was struck not just by the dishonesty of this smear, but by the glee over a young husband's and young father's death. Quote, she says, "He was an unrepentant racist, transphobe, homophobe, and misogynist." The Nation wrote, who often wrapped his bigotry in Bible verses because there was no other way to pretend that it was morally correct. He had children, as do many vile people. That's what they said. He had children, as do many vile people. Now, hours before this smear was published, my wife and I had the honor of escorting Charlie's body back to his home in Arizona. We took his wife, Erica, we love you, his parents, his sister, and a few of his best friends with us. And as they offloaded Charlie's casket from Air Force Two, I worried that Erica would collapse with grief. Now, I am a very lucky husband to a very wonderful wife, but I have never been prouder of my wife than that moment as she held Erica in Erica's very darkest hour. And I thought of Erica as I read that disgusting attack on Charlie. He had children, as do many vile people. That's what they said about him. I said the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I asked Usha what Erica had said to her earlier in the day in a private moment, and I asked Erica's permission to share this. My wife told me, she asked me for advice. Erica asked me for advice on how she should tell her children that their father had been murdered. She asked my wife how to tell her beautiful kids that their father and my dear, very dear friend is no longer with us. And as she was doing it, there were people dancing on that father's grave. Now, I have heard many calls in the last few days for unity and for healing in the wake of Charlie's assassination. You have no idea how desperately I want that, how gratified I was when Democratic friends and even former Senate colleagues reached out to offer their condolences to me. I'm so thankful. And I know there are so many like them all across our great country. I am desperate to wrap my arms around them as we all unite to condemn political violence and the ideas that cause it. Psalm 133 tells us, "Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious ointment upon the head." Oh, how badly have I craved that precious ointment in recent days, and I believe we can have it. But first,
More coming from Vice President Vance, because his closing of Charlie's show today is one of the great 13 minutes of broadcast I've heard, because he's celebrating a life well lived, though tragically short. Joined by Vic Mattis, the arts and culture editor of the Washington Free Beacon, co-host of the Getting Hammered podcast. And usually our segment is lighthearted, and usually our segment is fun, but the events of the last 5 days demand that it not be. Vic, first, your reaction to the murder of Charlie.
Well, as you know, Hugh, we're here at the Washington Free Beacon. We have a newsroom that's generally pretty quiet unless something is important and breaking, the president, a press conference or something to that effect. So I'm in my office. I keep my door ajar just to keep an eye on the rest of the newsroom and how everybody's doing. And again, it's usually very quiet. Suddenly I hear the volume from the TV booming. And it was from the news station, and it was reports of something that had just happened, and it just had that tone of something very awful. And the first thing I thought about, of course, was the president, and was reminded of what happened at Butler. So I stopped everything that I was doing, and I looked out, and I was really not expecting Charlie Kirk to be the subject of this terrible thing. Particularly, they start talking about Utah, and I'm immediately thinking, well, I don't think the president and the vice president are in Utah right now, so what's going on over there? And then they said he was hurt. We also had a source who knew somebody, a nurse at the hospital, and they said that he was brought in, and that it was grim. And so that's that I think we got the sense, and obviously there's awful video out there. I don't recommend people looking at that, but it's clear what happened to him was extremely traumatic and devastating. But we already started to prepare in our minds. As you know, you have to switch over, Hugh, into that sort of we're in the news business. What do we do now, and what are we reporting on, and what do we know, and more importantly, what don't we know? Because there's so many people out there who have to jump in and put in more than the 2 cents. They've got it all figured out, and they've got feelings, and they've got to say this or that, and it's not good. And you have to wait to, hear what we know before you can make any sort of pronouncement. Everyone feels this compulsion, especially in social media, to have to say, here, tell the world, here's what I think is it really matters. And just hold on 1 second. And Lawrence Tribe is a perfect example of this, as you know, the lawyer Lawrence Tribe and law professor, who immediately said, oh, it's case closed. His parents are Republicans. This is a MAGA type who shot and killed Charlie Kirk. And then he had to delete that post. I mean, people are making fools of themselves. And in other cases, they're getting themselves fired.
Vic, I had Justice Barrett on today, and I have the balance of that interview will air, and the transcript will be up. And I asked her about the Brandenburg test. And I try to use terms that the audience would understand. For speech to be prohibited, it must be intended to cause violence and have the imminent potential for doing so. It is almost impossible to regulate speech. And she said, she doesn't do policy, she's a justice, but she commented on the bar is very high for Congress. Do you think Congress ought to try, or ought they to do what the justice, you can read it for yourself, implied, which is the solution lies elsewhere? You cannot regulate this.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's an excellent question that you had for Justice Amy Coney Barrett, by the way, Hugh. The Brandenburg case, which I believe that is in Ohio, and that involved the white supremacist who was charged with incitement, but he wasn't. And of course, this came up obviously in January 6, 2021, for the very same reason. It's a very high bar, what causes incitement. Right now, I don't know about whether or not Congress can be effective in trying to get anything involved in this nature. What bothers me most, Hugh, is people saying that what Charlie Kirk was saying was divisive, and that he was a provocateur, and that what he was saying was causing the incitement. And then, as you know, Matthew Dowd on another network got in trouble, and rightfully so, got terminated for saying that, well, hateful words, will inevitably spark hateful action. So he had it coming, basically. No, that's not how it is at all. I have this terrible fear, Hugh, that what the left's answer to political violence and how to stop political violence is just don't say anything that we might deem offensive, because then you might have it coming. That really, for me, that's what I worry about, because uh, just the absolute glee on the other side about what happened here and that it was justified and the rationalizations. It's very macabre.
I had a friend talk to me about this weekend, and I said, "Why are they insane?" And he said, "Alinsky." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes, Saul Alinsky laid it out, isolate, satirize, freeze, and make what was unthinkable thinkable." I'm compressing 14 rules for radicals into. Do you think that's it? Do you think the left is beyond repair? This is not the Democratic Party that you and I grew up with.
No, but you could also make the case, I guess, that with keeping that in mind, that this has been, a slow burn, that this has been, an ongoing, very slow process. We used to brush this off. I remember back in the 90s and being in college and, insane politically, politically correct professors and all their crazy ideas. And we used to think, well, that's just college. Wait till these kids get out into the real world, then they'll know what it's really like. And they're not going to have these insane thoughts. But of course, now we feel, again, I've said this before, it's like the inmates running the asylum. All of a sudden, those radical professors have successfully brainwashed radical students who are now in charge in a lot of places. And they've created this atmosphere where this sort of behavior is absolutely acceptable, where they're talking about justifying murder. I mean, there was the president, I believe it's of the Oxford Union, the debate society.
He's going to be recalled. He's going to be recalled. But what I want to make sure the audience understands is it's nothing Charlie said at Utah Valley. The killer planned this before Charlie set foot on the campus and had been radicalized. He only did a half semester at Utah State. It wasn't the professors, it's the web.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I want to point out for your listeners as well, Hugh, Aaron Sabarium of the Washington Free Beacon has a terrific piece up. It's devastating. It's very disturbing about the chat room that the suspect was in and the back and forth where they do talk ahead of time as early as August. They're talking about September 10 being a very interesting date. They say it there in the chat room. They say, oh, wouldn't it be something if something happened to Charlie Kirk on September 10? And then this was again coming up on September 3rd. So yes, this is something that they've clearly been thinking about. I know people like Politico keep on saying, well, we don't know what the motive is, but I think we're beginning to know what the motive is, Hugh.
Victorino Mattis at X, the Washington Free Beacon. You ought to read every day. And when Getting Hammered is back, you ought to listen to that. Thank you, Vic. I have not forgotten the market report. I know that you want to know, so I will give it to you now. Brought to you by American Federal. AmericanFederal.com buys and sells gold, silver, and other precious metals. For the very small number of you who do collectibles, they do that as well. Their phone number is 800-221-7694, and they sponsor the market report and have for well over 2 years now. And I buy my gold from Nick Grovich and his team at American Federal, 800-221-7694, 800-221-7694. Some of you have wondered, how long can the gold run go on? Well, a lot of people have predicted a long time. A lot of people are naysayers. I just tell you the news. Gold went up another 0.94% today to $3,720.90 an ounce. That is unprecedented in my 25 years of broadcast, $3,720.90 an ounce. Now, I personally don't think that's going to go down. I'm going to buy the same amount of gold next year as I did this year, regardless of price, because it's called dollar cost averaging, and that's the smart way to buy gold. But if you want to develop a strategy for buying gold, talk to Nick Grovich first. 800-221-7694. So gold was up 0.94%. That's what the NASDAQ was up today. So gold and the tech-heavy NASDAQ are not moving in opposite directions. They're moving in the same direction. The Dow was only up 0.11, and the S&P was only up 0.47. But the NASDAQ was up 0.94, and gold was up 0.94. I repeat, I do not give financial advice, never have. I do know if you're going to buy gold, though, you can trust Nick Grovich to be transparent, fair-minded, be absolutely every step of the way will be laid out for you. And it isn't complicated. You don't need an IRA to buy gold. You can just buy gold. And you can do it with Nick Grovich at 800-221-7694. I also want to remind you I'm in the Relief Factor studio every hour of every program. That is 5 days a week, 3 times a show, 15 times a week. I remind you, Relief Factor works. Now, I have not done anything other than fly for 5 days and drive to airports. And so I am going to end up tomorrow putting the miles in, and we'll feel it, and that's okay. Because I have taken my Relief Factor, and I will take it again tomorrow, and you'll see me take it on the show if you saw me take it on the show, if you're watching on the Salem News Channel today. And I'm here to tell you, all you need to do is call 1-800, the number 4, and the word relief, and they'll give you the special for the 3-week starter pack, $19.95, less than $1 a day. Try it for yourself, 3 packets a day for the first week, 2 packets a day for the second week. Then you're on the 1 packet a day, and for me, it's forever. It's the only supplement I've taken for more than 20 years, the only one I've taken for the last 12 years, and I take it every day, and I recommend you do too. So call 1-800, the number 4, and the word relief, or go to their website and find the starter pack there at relieffactor.com, relieffactor.com. Coming up, Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, the conclusion of my interview with Justice Amy Coney Barrett about her brand new book, Listening to the Law, and Bethany Mandel. A lot ahead on today's Hugh Hewitt Show. Senator Joni Ernst has long time been a friend of this program, and it is good to see you again, Senator. I'm sorry it's a situation our colleague Charlie gunned down, and I want to begin there with you. You've gone into war zones. You've been in war zones as a soldier, and you've gone into war zones repeatedly over the course of your service in the Senate on Codels and everything else. What was your reaction to this, and what do we do going forward about it?
Hugh, thank you so much. Absolutely heartbroken. And I think there are so many of us, especially in the halls of Congress, that saw Charlie as this bright, young, rising star that really garnered the interest and attention of so many young conservatives and even those outside of that conservative spectrum that wanted to find their place here in the United States of America. And he did that quite well. He could reason, he could debate, he could really lay out his points very convincingly. And he brought so many young people into the fold of our Republican Party, conservative, obviously leaders. So it has been a devastating blow. But what I have said many times over is that Charlie's voice will continue to be amplified in this. And it is just devastating. I really, really am concerned about, of course, his wonderful wife and his beautiful children. But I know that the movement will be strengthened because of their love for Charlie and our love for Charlie and everything that he has done for our great party and for the United States of America. So this is not the end, Hugh. I think Turning Point USA will continue to move forward and really take up this tragedy as a way to spurn further action in the future.
So, Senator, I had Justice Barrett on earlier today, remarkable jurist, and I asked her in layman's terms about the Brandenburg case, because it's very hard to do anything about speech on the internet. It's almost impossible. The justice doesn't weigh in on what Congress might or might not do, but it's very hard for Congress to legislate about the deep web. The suspected killer of Charlie spent less than a half semester at college. It's not college. He wasn't poisoned by college. He was poisoned by the web. And I don't know, do you think there's anything that can be done? You're retiring. And by the way, thank you for your service these many years. You've been such a fantastic United States Senator. But to your colleagues, what do you say? I don't think there is anything to be done other than to improve the culture generally.
Right. And Hugh, I think that is exactly it, is that we have to focus on our own homes. We have to focus on our own lives. And we really do have to police up what our children are viewing. And we've heard this in many schools across the nation where states are telling their school systems, no more phones in school. Let's focus on our studies. I think that social media has gone far, far too out on the fringes and really are poisoning the minds of our young people. I don't believe it is something that can be regulated by Congress, but we have to have active engagement by the families with their own family members, with our own children. Otherwise, you do see social media influencing our children as they are growing. It can have a very positive effect. I know that my own daughter and son-in-law, they have long followed Charlie Kirk, and so I saw that that was a tremendous benefit for social media. But then you have the hate speech that is out there that will come from the fringes. So no, I don't think there is anything constructively that Congress can do. But I do think at the state level and what can be focused on in the school systems, but most certainly, again, we need to be taking care of our own homes and our own families. And unfortunately, we have a lot of parents across America today that are really disengaged from what their own children are doing or participating in, especially when it comes to the internet and social media.
Wise words, Senator. I have to catch up with you about your trip to Israel, especially today with Secretary Rubio there, side by side, no distance between the United States and Israel. But some of our Arab allies are making noises about breaching peace deals with. It's especially rumored about Egypt and President Sisi. What is your word of wisdom to our Arab allies who have reached normalcy? The goal of Hamas was to destroy that. Do we think they're going to do that?
Hamas has been a blip on the pathway to peace and stability in the Middle East. And we have President Trump to thank for that with the Abraham Accords and bringing Arab partners into the fold with Israel. Are we at a tenuous point? Certainly we are, but we continue to see Arab leaders moving forward with the thoughts of normalization with Israel. It is a difficult time. We all realize this, but with Iran being tamped down, and hopefully we can keep our boot on their neck, they are less able to fund terrorist proxies throughout the region. And it is so important that Secretary Rubio, President Trump, others continue on with the mission of stabilizing our partners throughout the Middle East. We know that if the Middle East is stabilized, then we are safer here in the United States of America, unless that threat of terrorist attack on our homeland. So the mission of the president, the mission of Secretary Rubio is very, very important right now. I would continue leaning on our Arab friends and allies to continue looking to the West for their support, for their guidance, for partnerships. We can do this through the Abraham Accords as we celebrate the 5th anniversary. I've worked extensively on the issues in the Middle East, stemming from my own time serving in the United States Army and the National Guard in the Middle East. It is important that we continue to move forward, not only for our partners in that region and our most valuable partner, Israel, but also for our own peace and security here in the United States of America.
Senator Ernst, on the trip, were you able to go, for example, right behind Israel in terms of our allies is the United Arab Emirates, what General Mattis used to call Little Sparta. Have you been able to talk with their representatives about how important it is that the accords endure and are strengthened and expanded?
Absolutely. And I am a frequent visitor to UAE and making sure that I sit down with MBZ and all of his lieutenants or captains, of course, across the Emirates, and stressing how important this relationship is. I will be sitting down with their ambassador to the United States here in the next several days here in Washington, D.C., and continuing to stress our relationship and how important it is with UAE and how important it is that we maintain the Abraham Accords alliances. Again, it is a difficult time in the Middle East, but we have to remember who was behind October 7th. Who instigated this incident in Israel? It was Iran. It was their terrorist proxies with Hamas. We have seen Hezbollah. We've seen the Houthis. These are all common enemies of our Arab partners in the Middle East. So again, continuing to work on these relationships is extremely important. And that's why I'm glad that the president, as well as Secretary Rubio and others, are constantly engaging with leaders leadership with our most important partners. Number one, Israel, but then also our other Abraham Accords partners. I believe that the UAE was the first signatory of the Abraham Accords. They are an incredibly important key to making sure that we stabilize the region. They've been great partners to us. We will continue working with them.
That's a great relief. I'm glad you're meeting with Ambassador Ataibi. I believe that he was really the prime mover behind the Abraham Accords. I think if you dig down and you look at his editorial about annexation of West Bank territories 5.5 years ago, he got the ball going. And so I'm glad to hear that. What are you most concerned? We had a minute, Senator. Which country among our allies are you most concerned about ties fraying between Israel with?
Well, I'm not going to call out any names today, but I would tell you, Hugh, that we continue to work on the relationships and make sure that all of our Accord partners are working together. And that's why it is so important to see President Trump traveling through the region. It is something that we did not see in the Biden administration. He simply wasn't capable of working on the Accords nor traveling. We have a strong president that is exhibiting leadership that has been lacking across the past 4 years in the previous administration. President Trump is committed to peace. We need that. We need our partners to stay engaged. So while I do worry about these tenuous times, I don't worry that President Trump is going to show the leadership necessary to keep all of our partners engaged. And they are valuable partners. I just want to publicly thank all of the members of the Accords. I want to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for continuing to move forward towards some sort of normalization. Again, things are difficult, but we're appreciative of all of the efforts of our partners.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Good words, wise words. I appreciate your efforts on that on behalf of the Accords. They're vital to our interests. Bethany Mandel is the co-founder of the MomWars.substack.com. Bethany, I talked to Justice Barrett earlier today. I asked her as a mom, what are we going to do about the culture of violence in the United States? And she walked me through the very rigorous protocols in the Coney Barrett household for internet devices. And then she cited sua sponte, nice legal term there for you, the anxious generation making our teenagers read it. What do you have to add to that?
I can't wait to listen to that segment, actually. So I wrote about this for the Mom Wars on Substack today, actually. I'm very reticent to extrapolate too much into the mom's social media presence. And I'm also very reticent because these parents have had a real tragedy befall their family, and they did the right thing in turning him in. And I don't know if many people would do that. So I want to put all those caveats out there. It seems like he spent a lot of time unsupervised on the internet, and that was a real misstep. Abigail Schreier also wrote this for the Free Press that came out this morning, and Liz Wheeler tweeted about it this morning. But there is a tendency among parents of my generation to very passively parent instead of doing it as a verb. And the end result is we have kids who have had no direction morally, spiritually, academically, but really those first two are the most important. And they're influenced by people online. And that's what we're seeing what happened to him on all of these sort of gamer Discord threads.
You know, I'm so old, I don't even know what Discord is, and I don't care. It's not my world. But I do want parents and young people to get the warnings that they would get about cigarette smoking, for goodness sake.
Yes.
If you go on the web, you're much more likely to have a public health issue in your life than if you smoke a carton of cigarettes a day. It's that real.
Yep, absolutely. No, I mean, the unfiltered access to the internet, which, by the way, comes through a smartphone. And this was something that in Anxious Generation he talked about a lot, how, by every metric of mental health for kids, whether it be depression, anxiety, you name it, it tanks when smartphones are introduced. You're giving your kid a window into the entire world when you hand them that device that they have access to 24/7. And of course, there's detrimental results. And it's really frustrating as a parent seeing fellow parents giving smartphones and iPhones to 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and your kid is the only one that isn't on the group chat and isn't, and it's very, very frustrating.
What do you make of the ubiquitousness, if that's a word, the ubiquity of devices in restaurants being handed to kids to calm them down? And, I don't want to guilt anyone. It's
I
something
do.
that happened without anyone being aware.
Yeah, it's really bad. I remember I walked into a restaurant with my kids. I think I had 5 of them at the time, and I didn't hand them anything. And a elderly couple moved tables away from us, and the kids sat nicely. We behaved. We were about to leave, and they walked up to us and they said, "We cannot remember the last time we saw kids at a restaurant who behaved without a screen attached." And when she said that to me, I thought to myself, oh my God, she's right. I don't remember the last time I saw that either. And it's this refusal to parent as a verb. Kids do not understand how to behave politely and calmly when there is no stimulation. And so they're constantly fed stimulation in the form of screens. And, this is you hook kids in at 2, 3 years old. They can't go through a supermarket or a restaurant without a screen. And then you fast forward when they're 14, 15, you put them on these gamer apps. Here we are.
The alternative was and remains reading. And the numbers on reading that came out last week are horrifying.
Yes.
So I don't know what the public schools are planning to do. Probably nothing. Probably nothing. But they ought to just stop everything until everyone can read to grade level, including math, I think.
I agree. I agree. It's funny. I homeschool my kids, and my 6th grader has reached the limits of my ability as a homeschool parent. So I've had to put her in math classes online this year. But no, I agree. It is an existential crisis, and they have decided that they need to teach SEL, social emotional learning, and all of that sort of psychobabble instead of just teaching them not only how to read but to love reading. And I think a lot of the transactional nature of reading in classrooms really does a real disservice to kids because they don't grow up to love it.
And I'm blessed that my grandchildren love to read. And that's because their parents love to read, and that's because their mother loved to read. Their grandmother loves to read. And I'm not taking any credit for that because I'm not part of the game. It's up to moms and the primary parenting. Sometimes it's dad. But I do think it's not insurmountable. All it requires is will in school boards to say, we will learn how to read. It's not hard. You just got to say, we're going to do it. You think any school district will? Will Montgomery County do it?
And my local school, if I sent my kids to the local elementary school, I think it's under 10% of kids are reading on grade level. So it's not looking great.
But no, that's not true.
Yeah.
Under 10%?
Yeah.
All right. So public service announcement. People have to run for school board and be willing to fire superintendents and break tenure agreements and handle the lawsuits. What do you think?
Yeah. No, absolutely. But also, you have to donate and you have to volunteer for school board races too. I ran for school board here in Montgomery County. You promoted that so much, and your listeners are the reason why my campaign was funded at all. But I didn't even make it to the primary. People need to know more about who's running and help those candidates.
Or they have to, and this is not an attack on you and Seth, they have to move. I know you guys have reasons for
We
staying there.
homeschool for a
but
reason.
Yeah, but you have to leave. Your tax dollars are still supporting that, though, right? You're
Yep.
still
They're lighting on fire every single day.
every day, and so if you move to a district that teaches reading, at least your property taxes won't go to the radical left. Last question. I'm disturbed by what I see online. I'm not going to give much attention to it, but I mean it's crazy.
Yeah, what's more disturbing to me, honestly, I think anyone can sort of cherry pick, this post, whatever. What really has freaked me out over the course of the last almost week is seeing people that I know personally say, well, what's the big deal? Well, I don't see a vigil at the Kennedy Center for XYZ, you know, tragedy. And what's interesting to me about those posts is that they're telling on themselves, because the left is incapable of rallying its troops the way the right is. And the right is capable of putting together a vigil at the Kennedy Center, which I attended last night with Seth, where there were thousands of people there. The right is capable of doing that organizationally because of people like Charlie Kirk, but mostly Charlie Kirk.
Mostly Charlie Kirk. Bethany Mandel, thank you very much for your time. Follow her at Bethany Shondark. Subscribe to the momwars.substack.com and help it grow and spread good, serious parenting across the country. The momwars.substack.com. Coming up after the break, the conclusion of my interview with Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett, about her new book, Listening to the Law. It's a fabulous book. Listening to the Law is a fabulous book, and the interview was fabulous. I got to talk to Justice Barrett last week. This was part two. I always prepare, but I really prepare for justices of the Supreme Court. It's a subspecialty, and it takes time. You know what else takes time? It'll take a minute of your time to talk to a real live representative at Consumer Cellular. Really, just less than a minute, because all their people are right here in the United States. And so you'll call 1-800-411-4454, 1-800-411-4454, and you'll hit one button, and then you'll be talking to a real live human being. Now, I do want you to get your phone bill out before you call them. I want you to write down my code, Hugh25, because you want to save $5 a month for the first 5 months if you make the switch, and you should make the switch, especially if you're 50 years and older. You're just paying too much for data. I don't even have to see your phone bill. Unless you're me, you don't need unlimited data. Unless you're a journo or someone living in the public square, and I probably don't even need unlimited data. But I get it, just in case news breaks I have to follow very, very closely. But if you're 50 years and older, you can get 2 lines of unlimited data for $60 a month. And I'm betting that when you look at your phone bill, you're going to say, really? $60 a month for unlimited data? And Consumer Cellular says yes. So call them. You can keep your number, you can keep all your data, keep all your contacts, but you have to call them. 800-411-4454, and my code is Hugh25. 1-800-411-4454. 1-800-411-4454. Also need to tell you about our friends at Americans for a Balanced Budget. Now, there are going to be regular appropriation bills coming along. And at that point, they need to consider what impact the end of the health care credits are going to do to consumers who have been forced into the state exchanges by Obamacare. StopHealthCostHikes.com explain who those tax credits have to be targeted towards from Americans for a Balanced Budget. People got forced into the exchanges. Obamacare is a nightmare, and it's wildly expensive to buy from the state exchanges, and there's no alternative for a lot of people who lost their health care because President Obama was not faithful to the promise that if you like your plan, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. That didn't happen. A lot of people lost their plans. And job changes came along, and they found out that employers no longer offered health care. So now you have to go to those exchanges, and when you go there, you're going to need some help from the federal government in the form of a tax credit. StopHealthCostHikes.com. Go there, register, tell them you want the appropriation process to assure that tax credits are there in the final appropriation bill when it passes through regular order, because they got to discuss it in regular order. StopHealthCostHikes.com. StopHealthCostHikes.com. Don't get left behind, or you're going to get sticker shock come January or come your tax return time if those tax credits are gone in 2026. And they are gone right now. They're scheduled to sunset. And it's good policy not to screw people a second time. Obamacare needs a complete rework, and maybe the Democrats will get serious about that. In the meantime, add your voice to those at StopHealthCostHikes.com. Coming up, Justice Barrett, but I want to remind you, I'm in the Relief Factor studio. Took my Relief Factor in the first segment today and first hour today, and you saw me do it. I do it every single day on the air because I want you to know I do believe in the product. I take the product. I've done so for 12 years. and it's the only supplement I've taken for more than 20. And a lot of people want to pay me a lot of money to take a different supplement. Don't need it, don't want it. I want to be able to continue to get my miles in. I want to be able to continue to fly the crazy schedule that I had last week and not walk out bent over and not worry about the dreaded overhead bin. And that's what Relief Factor does. It gets rid of the minor aches and pains that accompany exercise and aging. You're definitely getting older every day, and new pains will arrive. You won't be expecting it, and it'll sneak up on you, but you don't have to put up with it. You can prevent it, in fact, with the Relief Factor. And you can do it right now for $19.95 starter pack. That's what 3-week supply does. And the starter pack means 3 packets of Relief Factor a day for the first week, 2 packets of Relief Factor a day for the second week, and then you're on the 1 packet a day like I have been for 12 years. Boy, does this stuff work. 1-800, the number 4, and the word relief. Thousands of you have taken it. Thousands of you have continued taking it. Thousands of you know it works, it works, it works. Because it's Icarian, curcumin, and resveratrol and omega. Ask your doctor. ReliefFactor.com. The starter pack is there. You can call 1-800, the number 4, and the word relief. 1-800-4RELIEF, or go to their website, ReliefFactor.com. Either place, ask for the starter pack. Come back for the conclusion of my interview with Justice Barrett about her book, Listening to the Law. Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined me earlier today. This is the conclusion of my interview about her wonderful new book, Listening to the Law.
So I think you need to understand that. I think administrative law really is a whether you're going to do a transactional practice or whether you're going to litigate, you have to know how to deal with regulations. So I think, and statutory interpretation, that's something that I taught for a long time and that I still teach. Everybody has to deal with statutes. That's a very practical skill to know the kinds of arguments to make and know your way around textualism. And we mentioned Justice Breyer and, Justice Breyer's pragmatist approach. You need to know how to argue before judges who take both different approaches.
You quote Judge Friendly quoting Justice Frankfurter, the basic rules of statutory interpretation are simple. 1, read the statute. 2, read the statute. 3, read the statute. It's sort of a Breyer versus Barrett over the validity of including how one uses the text. And I think you're both I'd like to see that debate. Do you talk with him as a retired justice with chambers still open and he's still working hard? Do you talk with him about these things?
I do, and actually we have had that debate. We participated in an event at the court in front of a group just last year, and we did a discussion. It wasn't so much a debate as a discussion about textualism versus Justice Breyer's more pragmatic approach.
I will look for that online. Bravo as well on a succinct, persuasive argument for the ongoing exile of legislative history from Supreme Court decision making. Can you explain to the audience why it doesn't matter that Senator Cotton says to Senator Graham X is allowed, or that Senator King says to Senator Van Hollen Y is allowed? Why does that not matter to you?
Well, as a formal matter, the legislative history has not gone through both houses of Congress and been signed by the president. It's not itself the law. And, as a practical matter, it's just the views of, in your example, say, Senator Cotton. It's not the views of a majority of both houses of Congress, and anybody can say anything they want in the legislative history. Often legislators themselves don't know what's in the legislative history. It's put in by staffers who might have gotten it from interest groups. And sometimes, I talk in the book about an example that I used to use in my statutory interpretation class. Sometimes it's a fiction. There are instances in which legislators insert supposed colloquies and dialogues that they have with one another that never actually happened, and they insert them in the record after the fact. So it's just not a reliable tool, apart from the fact that there's no constitutional basis for treating it as authoritative.
And does that, in fact, become even more relevant a consideration the longer back you go in the legislative history? Because the legislative history wasn't all that good, and the records weren't all that exact in the days of the early Congresses. Do we look even more askance the older the legislative history?
That's funny that you asked that question, because there have actually been studies. The court didn't really start looking at legislative history until Holy Trinity versus United States, that notorious case. That was one of the first cases that really looked at legislative history, in addition to the dubious approach that it took to interpreting statutes at all. It was after that case that legislative history started to balloon, and some scholars have argued that there was a feedback effect, that the more the court cited legislative history, the more Congress created legislative history. That makes it more
well said.
suspect in my view.
I want to close, Justice, by getting to the heart of your argument about originalism, which I think is on page 200. In my view, departing from the original meaning differs in degree but not in kind from departing from the text outright. The primary difference between originalism and other approaches is that originalists treat historical meaning as determinative, while non-originalists sometimes prioritize other considerations such as purposes or values underlying a constitutional provision. Is that the heart of originalism?
I think it is, yes. I make the point in the book, which I do think is an important one, that all justices, even those who don't consider themselves originalists, at least all justices to my knowledge, take history into account. So I think sometimes people who are outside the court caricature originalism by saying, oh, well, only crazy originalists consider the history. That's not so. But originalists do treat the historical meaning of the text where it's determinative as conclusive. Whereas, for example, Justice Breyer in his most recent book makes the argument that, well, that's one thing to consider, but there might be other considerations that would overcome the historical meaning.
So I want to do something, which is to give time back to a justice, not unlike giving time back to a court, 2 minutes. And I want to know when you hear that, I'd like to give time back to the court. Are you happy, or are you sad, or are you surprised?
You mean when you've given time back to me,
No,
or in an
no, when
actual
someone in the
argument?
court, when an oral argument says, I'm going to give time back to the court. Do you like that?
It happens very, very rarely. I'm trying to remember if it's happened before the court. Yeah, it's happened before the court. And usually I think that's a sign of strength, because a lawyer who does that recognizes the strength of his position and that there's nothing more to be said, or can read the bench, knows how to read the room, and sees that the justices themselves have no further questions. So it's usually a good thing.
Well, Justice Barrett, thank you again for your time. I will be replaying our Nixon Library conversation. Between the two of them, I will have asked and answered all my questions. Good luck in the term ahead, and I appreciate the time very much. Listening to the Law, a great read for everyone. Thank you, Justice Barrett.
Thank you, Hugh.
I got to tell you, it's a rare privilege to talk to Supreme Court justices, and thus far, Justice Thomas has been here, Justice Breyer, Justice Gorsuch, now Justice Barrett. I know a couple of them listen to the program most days on AM 570 in Washington, D.C. when they're driving home, and I try and conduct the program that way. Now, a lot of discourse in America has fallen off of a cliff. Doesn't have to. You can be interesting, you can get fine guests, you can engage in this, you can be good without being morons. But I have seen so much vile stuff in the days since Charlie's murder. It's beyond regulation. I want you to understand that. The Brandenburg test is very, very difficult to satisfy. You can say vile stuff in America. You don't have to amplify it. You don't have to write it. You don't have to reveal yourself as a moral pygmy. But mostly it requires training in classrooms of the young and the not so young on how to talk. And not on how to feel, but how to conduct themselves with the decency that a free republic requires. And boy, that is missing on the left, and it needs to be returned there, especially among the radical left. As you can tell from my conversation with Senator Ernst, I'm very pro-Israel and very supportive of everything that supports the Jewish state. An organization that sponsors my show, that in fact also does great things for Israel, is the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. Now, I am hoping they meet a lot of needs in Israel. The IFCJ meets a lot of needs, ifcj.org. And I am hoping, and I've asked, would they please give me confirmation that along with the elderly, the poor in Israel, people they take care of, have they begun to consider supporting the Israeli Defense Ministry's Rehabilitation Department? Because I read in Amit Segal's It's Noon in Israel newsletter this morning the following. The Defense Ministry's Rehabilitation Department published a summary in the lead up to the 2-year anniversary of October 7, and the numbers are horrifying. According to its report, since the October 7th massacre, the department has begun treating 20,000 new wounded IDF soldiers. 20,000. And it's expected to receive another 20,000 by 2028. There is a severe shortage of caregivers and a caregiver-patient ratio of 1 to 750. 55% of the wounded IDF soldiers suffer various psychological conditions such as PTSD. When it comes to a return to normalcy, they are struggling even more than the physically wounded, Amit writes. Only 48% of psychologically affected soldiers have returned to work, compared to 67% of the physically injured. In what likely only compounds the problem, wounded Israelis are waiting on average for 3 to 4 months for a psychiatric appointment. Prior to the October 7, 2023 massacre, the department within the IDF was responsible for 11,000 people with psychological issues. That has since jumped by 180% to 31,000, and it's expected to hit 50,000 by 2028. I won't pretend, Amit writes, to have a solution to the issue, but what we can all do is pray that every one of these individuals and their families receive the support they need to get through these unimaginable challenges. Well, I am willing to bet that the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews is on it, ifcj.org, if you want to be in on helping Israel, because they are our front line and they are the equal of any of our allies, and this is a big, big issue for them. You got to realize for every number I gave you, multiply it by 30 to get the American equivalent. So that would be like 600,000 soldiers in need of psychological caregiving, and an even worse ratio in terms of providers. Just go to ifcj.org. ifcj.org. Be as generous as you can. Great organization, long-standing supporter of Israel and of Christians and Jews working together. International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. ifcj.org. I'll bring you updates on that. Thank you for listening today. The transcript of Justice Barrett, Dwayne has worked on and is posted over at hughhewitt.com. The video is at my YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe when you go there. I greatly appreciate it.